Welcome to Stand in the Gap Today with your host, the Honorable Sam Rohrer, President of the American Pastors Network, addressing the most pressing issues impacting our economy, our homes, our churches, our culture, and our daily lives from a biblical and constitutional perspective.
Is a biblically prophesied war between Israel and her neighbors imminent? Is it coming? Are we feeling and sensing that? Well, today on this bi-monthly Israel and Prophecy Update program, Bill Salus, founder of Prophecy Depot Ministers and a regular guest on this program, he and I are going to explore what the Bible says about prophesied wars, plural, in the Middle East, which one is next, and how the headline news events of today that we're talking about may actually be unfolding, and we're seeing biblical prophecy right in front of us. Now, the title I've chosen today is actually a title of an article and a DVD, a book, and some other things by my guest, Bill Salus, coming out of a passage in Isaiah 17. It's a prophesied war there that includes Syria and Damascus in particular. The title is this: The Proxy War That Shakes Israel. And with that introduction, I welcome Bill Salus back to the program. Bill, thanks for being back with me today.
Sam and all the listeners, it's great to be back with you all.
And Bill, it's great to have you back. You've been very busy. You do a lot of writing. You have a tremendous website, prophecydepot.com, that people can find information on, and I'll give that again. But Bill, in the last month, there have been attacks. We've all seen them. Everybody's looking. Attacks into Israel from Syria. Israel's responded by attacking certain locations in Syria and in Damascus, where many believe that weapons are actually being manufactured there from which they will be launched into Israel. So Israel's concerned logically. But because of this, Bill, I've seen a lot of commentary from people suggesting that perhaps the prophecy concerning Israel destroying Damascus, which a lot of people have heard about, they're saying that this maybe is right at the door. Well, the relevancy of these headline news, Bills, and these observations is part of the reason for our focus today. But before I get into that, which we'll get into in the next segment and beyond, could you give an overview what the Bible foretells about the multiple wars, because it's not just one, multiple wars which will impact Israel from where we are now through the coming of the second coming of Christ? What's going to happen? Because the road gets pretty bumpy for Israel, doesn't it?
Well, it really does, and not just Israel, but the future for the world is a war-torn world. And my new book called The Future War Prophecies, it's a book and a DVD. I show about 15 different wars that are prophetic wars that are stage-setting, some of them even as we speak. Some could happen. Some are imminent. For instance, this Isaiah 17 war with Syria and Israel could actually be imminent at this point. I'm going to run through, just rifle these off kind of quickly. There's going to be a war with Iran. There's two wars with Iran. One is in Ezekiel 38, where they're involved with Russia and Turkey. A lot of your listeners may be familiar with that Gog and Magog invasion, but they're also involved in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39 in a war. And then there's the war between Israel and Syria, which we'll be talking about today. The proxies of Iran, I think, are going to be involved in that war as well, and that would include Hezbollah and Hamas, etc. I think there'll be a final Arab-Israeli war in Psalm 83 that may be triggered by this war in Syria. Ezekiel 38 we talked about. There's the seal judgments open up after the church has been raptured, and you have the white horseman. That's the Antichrist, and he's involved in wars, we're told in Daniel chapter 11. You get the fiery red horseman, the second horse of the apocalypse, who's given a great sword, and it looks like that will be a world war or world wars at that point maybe. Then there's the fourth horseman, the pale horseman, who actually is involved in holy wars. He says that horseman has control or authority over a quarter of the earth to kill through multiple means. Then there's a couple of demonic invasions in the trumpet judgments. The fifth trumpet has this so-called locusts that torment unsaved people for 5 months. That's into the tribulation period. The sixth trumpet talks about a 200 million man army that's got to be demonic. We know from the details, and they actually kill a third of mankind. Then there's, in the mid part of the tribulation, there's a war in heaven between Satan and Michael the archangel. Satan loses. He gets cast down to the earth with his fallen angels. He knows his time is short. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth, we're told in Revelation chapter 12. Then at that point, the 10 kings will be on the world. They'll desolate the harlot world religion that's going on. That'll be a massive event going on in the mid part of the trib. Then the bowl judgments are when God pours his wrath out. There'll be like a war from God against unsaved humanity. Then there's the final battle of Armageddon. I would go through 11 phases of that in the book. And then I think the wars are over. But at the end of the millennium, after the 1,000-year reign of Christ, there's a second war called Gog and Magog, where Satan musters up an international army and tries to come against the holy city Jerusalem and Jesus, who'll be reigning there at that point. Well, what's interesting, I put this in the book. You know, when I'm doing autograph books for the people who pre-ordered the book has actually come out right now. But I say, but these wars are the war-torn world that's coming is temporary, because we're told in Micah, verse 3 and 4, he, Jesus Christ, when he's on the earth reigning in the millennium, shall judge between many peoples and rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore, but everyone will sit under his vine, under his fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. So in concluding this segment, Sam, I would say, look, a war-torn world is coming. A lot of the bad stuff's going to happen when the church is raptured, but not necessarily all of it. We could still go through some stuff that may happen in the Middle East. But the good news is, during the millennial kingdom, there will be no more wars. So, you know, the wars are coming, but they're going to be temporary, and ultimately there'll be no more war when Jesus reigns on the earth in the millennial kingdom.
And that is a great thing to look forward to, Bill. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go through these things now. I wanted to go to lay out the big picture. You got the big picture. Wars, rumors of wars increasing. You know, you probably never knew there were going to be so many, but that's some of what the Bible says. When you come back, we're going to now talk about and go into specifics on this. I'm going to call it the Isaiah War. Isaiah 17 talks about a war with Syria. We'll talk about the participants and the conditions existing at that point. My guest today, been with me many, many times, and many of you are familiar with him, is Bill Salus. He's the founder of Prophecy Depot Ministries, has a website at prophecydepot.com, and has actually a new DVD and a book coming out. We've already talked about a little bit in the last segment. You can find it at that website, and we'll talk about it further as we go into the program. But the theme that we've chosen for today actually comes off of an article that he wrote. It's part of this book, but I'm entitled this, The Proxy War That Shakes Israel. Now, if you're listening to the news, you can tell, and Bill and I were talking about it before we went on this program, it is very, very clear. Anyone who's watching Israel, anyone who is an astute student of prophecy, is very much aware that the ground is quickly changing in regard to Israel. I mean, just think about it. Who has been the friend of Israel that they could count on over the last years? It's been the United States. Not in every case. Obama administration started to go sideways on them a lot, correct? We remember that. But this administration that we have right now is completely turning things upside down. Israel right now does not have a friend. I'm going to put it that way. They don't have anybody that they can count on for sure. And that helps to prepare the ground for what we're talking about, I believe, here today. Now, in Isaiah 17, verses 1 to 6, the prophet Isaiah identifies numerous observations about a future war which will impact Israel. In the last segment, Bill talked about a lot of wars that are going to be happening, which we know the Bible says will take place. Though Israel in this particular war will win, it appears to leave the nation quite bloodied and weakened. The prophet uses very commonly understood agricultural illustrations to describe the conditions present at the time of this war. He identifies the participants in this war, and of course, talks about always there's an underlying purpose by God. Whenever there are wars, there's something that is happening, in desperation, after what would appear to be a full-fledged attack, such as is daily being threatened now by Iran, for instance, against Israel. Isaiah further describes an alliance of nations bordering Israel who take part, such as Syria. And taken together, properly understanding this prophecy should help all friends of Israel, you and me, students of prophecy, to watch the events of our day with an increasing faith in God and confidence in His promises to Israel, because they will not fail. They will come about. and it affects all of us as believers in Jesus Christ as well. So that's the foundation. Bill, according to this Isaiah 17 passage, can you expand on what I just described and give the overview of Isaiah's message within the context of his whole message there? Who's he talking to, and for what purpose do you think this prophecy was being given?
Absolutely, Sam. I think it's really important to do exactly that. Before we do, let's talk. This prophecy talks about Israel in a war with Syria, but not only Syria. It appears to be there are other, I'd say probably the proxies of Iran, but at least other peoples, perhaps nations involved. We're told in Isaiah 17, verses 12 through 13, which I'll quote hopefully during the show here. But before I say this, ultimately what happens is Israel destroys the city of Damascus. We're told in Isaiah 17:9. That Israel is responsible for that, but not only the destruction of Damascus, but also major Syrian cities. But we need to remind the listeners that Syria was involved in modern-day wars with Israel in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War of Independence. They were involved in the Six-Day War in June of 1967. Those wars included Egypt and Jordan as well. They were also involved in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And unlike Egypt and Jordan, who got tired of getting beat and thought it was politically expedient to have peace with Israel, so Egypt did a treaty with Israel in 1979. Jimmy Carter was president. Jordan followed suit in 1994 when Bill Clinton was president. But we need to remember, Syria never did sign a peace treaty with Israel. They are still at war. Matter of fact, a recent headline came out of Syria from Bashar al-Assad. The president said that Israel will keep attacking us as long as they're our enemy. Well, the prophecies tell us that they will always be their enemy. There's not going to be a peace treaty between Syria and Israel. Israel's been attacking Syria, especially around Damascus, quite frequently. Matter of fact, at least 3 or 4 times already this year. Here's a couple of headlines. Here's the PBS NewsHour. On April 5th says Israel airstrikes on Syria intensify raising tension with Iran. It says they have hit the airports of Damascus and Aleppo. They hit Aleppo on, I think it was earlier, I forget the date of that, but it was this year. So they've hit the airports of Damascus and Aleppo. Aleppo is the number 1 populated city in Syria to the north. And so Israel is striking inside of important areas, airports, important cities. Here's a headline on August 6th of 2023. At least 4 Syrian soldiers killed in suspected Israeli airstrikes around Damascus. I'm going to give you one more headline, and I'll tell you why I'm doing this. On July 18th, AP reports suspected Israeli airstrike hit Damascus and the surrounding areas. These are all separate attacks on or around Damascus, and Damascus is a subject city of the prophecy of Isaiah 17 written around 700 BC. And that city, it says in Isaiah 17:1, it's become a ruinous heap. It's going to be reduced to rubble. I told you in Isaiah 17:9 that happens by the desolations caused by the children of Israel. And Isaiah 17:14, which concludes Isaiah's chapter, says that one night you see him, speaking of Damascus in the masculine pronoun, but in the morning he is no more. And it goes on to say, this is the portion of those who rob us and those who plunder us, meaning Israel has to do this in self-defense. They find themselves with their back against the wall in a prison rules war involving Syria and other advancing nations, and they have no choice but to take out the city. And it sounds nuclear. One night you see Damascus, but in the morning it's no more. It's reduced to rubble. It's razed. It's a razed. It's a ruinous heap of fallen ruins.
All right, you gave a great overview, and I think that was important to do that, Bill, because it means what we're talking about is no longer distant future 700 BC. It's now. We're beginning to see these things take place. Israel's back in the land. You've got Syria that's been involved. I'm glad you gave the history of their interaction with Israel. A lot of people probably didn't know that Syria is still at war with Israel, so it kind of explains why things are happening. But in that passage as well, it does identify the participants, identify what we know and why you suspect that there are proxies involved, and why do we think, or you think perhaps Iran may be involved in this? There are prevailing conditions that give some indication of passage. Kind of lay out some of the conditions prevailing at the point that Syria and others would likely attack Israel, according to Isaiah 17.
Yes. Well, Syria is involved, of course, because Israel goes to war with them and takes out that city, but also desolates other strong major cities, we're told. In Jeremiah chapter 49, we're told probably what cities those are. I'll go there in a moment. But also we talk about not only major Syrian cities, so it's just not Damascus versus Jerusalem, it's Syria versus Israel. But Isaiah 17 verses 12 through 13 says, "Listen, the armies of many nations roar like the roaring of the sea. Hear the thunder of the mighty forces. And they rush forward like thundering waves. But though they thunder like breakers on a beach, God will silence them, and they will run away. They will flee like chaff scattered by the wind, like a tumbleweed whirling before a storm." Meaning, it's not just at this time, it's not just Syria versus Israel, it's armies of many nations involved. So, we're not told specifically in this passage what the armies of the many nations are, but when you go into Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 23 through 27, I think you have a different camera angle of this invasion, what's going to happen. And it talks about Hamath and Arpad are shamed. They've heard bad news. There's trouble on the sea. And Hamath and Arpad would be other major Syrian cities inside of Syria. Aleppo would probably be Arpad, number one populated city inside of Syria. Damascus is the number two populated city. Homs and Hamath are probably Hamath. They put those together, the number three populated cities. But the point is that trouble on the sea, well, that's probably the Mediterranean Sea. And Mediterranean Sea is where Israel has Dolphin-class submarines with nuclear weapons capability launching into Syria. So we're talking about a reality that exists today. We're talking about cities that were prophesied: Damascus, Hamath, and Arpad. Jeremiah prophesied about Damascus, Hamath, and Arpad. Isaiah prophesied about strong cities. He prophesied about Damascus, and he also said there'd be many nations roaring like the seas coming against Israel. So this is not just another crosstown rivalry between Syria and Israel. This is going to be an all-out war.
And Bill, do we know, like, for instance, in the Ezekiel 38-39 war, which come later, we'll talk a little bit more about that, we have indication there that Russia's involved and they come down to take a spoil. You have a motivation for them. Do we have a motivation in this conflict of why Syria engages, or is it just because they hate Israel?
Well, I think the clue we would have in Isaiah 17 is verse 14. It says, "When I see Damascus in the morning, he is no more. This is the portion of those who rob us and plunder us." There's going to be a war. I think it's actually going to involve the ground troops, Hezbollah as well. Hezbollah has already said the next war will be fought in Galilee. That's one of the recent headlines. I think what's going to happen is there's going to be an invasion of Israel by whoever's all involved here, probably definitely Syria, probably the proxies as well. You got Hamas, you got Hezbollah, you got the Houthis down in the Yemen area, you got now the Islamic Jihad Palestinians inside the West Bank, you've got the Shiite militias in Iraq, you got Syria, etc. Israel's surrounded by proxies that have very lethal weapons. They can wipe Israel off the map at this point, including Iran trying to get a nuclear weapon.
And ladies and gentlemen, the thing is, just think about where Israel is right now. With the United States backing out, they can't count on us. Who is there to come to their aid other than God? Well, they got a lot of enemies. We're talking about one of those. As we come back, I want to talk with Bill further about this passage in Isaiah from the standpoint of when this war takes place, the scope of it, and then how it ends. Bill, I want you to further explain the other aspects of Isaiah 17 and the scope and what we know, how big that war is, and the ground war, the air war, whatever we can say about it. But this book that you've written, just coming out now, The Future War Prophecies, takes a closer look at the broader amount of wars you talked about in segment one, and then it gets into this one too. But from your perspective, why is it important for true believers to understand the battles which are coming, what's happening to Israel? Why? I mean, for Jews, there's a reason for it. Maybe you want to say what that is. But for us as the church, the believers, why should we be interested in knowing and understanding these things that the Scripture says will come to pass?
Well, I think it's really important. You're right about Israel. I mean, Israel needs to know because they're sort of the center of a lot of the end times wars, and probably the ones that are going to happen next. Also, the other people who need to be concerned about Bible prophecy and these wars would be the affected people, the indigenous population. So, for instance, it's important for people to know in Syria that Damascus is going to be destroyed and reduced to rubble, and other major Syrian cities are going to be desolated. It's also important for people in the west coast of Iran to know a prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 49 in the ancient territory of Elam that talks about there'll be a worldwide scattering from a disaster that gets created there. So all these people need to know ahead of time so they can get prepared and have an exit strategy. But from a Christian perspective, it's very important to understand these prophecies, because when they happen, we can evangelize through these things. God is giving us a silver platter of prophetic morsels so that we can actually take that out into a lost world and say, look, the Bible talked about the days in which you live. The Bible, the God who loves you, He gave us this information because He loves us and wants to equip us for the days in which we live. So evangelism is really important, but also for Christians as well as inhabitants of the world. The end times prophecies are world-changing events. They're globally impacting. People need to know what's coming so they can be prepared for what's going to happen. So let's take an example. You have a Middle East war, especially the one that's probably going to happen in Jeremiah chapter 49, the Iran prophecy, which I just mentioned a moment ago. Iran's already threatened to shut down the Strait of Hormuz in the event of an attack inside of Iran. Now, that's about a quarter of the world's oil still coming through that Strait of Hormuz. You're talking about stock market issues that'll be, be bad. You're talking about oil issues coming through. The whole economy of the world will change in light of that particular scenario there. So we also need to know whether these wars are coming so that we can be prepared for them and to evangelize through them.
Okay, that's perfect, and that's great. Now let's move, just because of time, let's move into the Isaiah 17 passage. That particular war, Syria comes down. You're calling it the proxy war that shakes Israel. To what degree do we know that the Bible says it will shake Israel as that battle ensues? Who starts it as an example? How deep into Israel do they go? Geographically, where is it going to take place? Lay out some of those facts that we can know from Isaiah 17 and other passages.
Well, we have a lot of details inside of those 14 verses in Isaiah 17. One of the things that we need to remember, and a lot of people don't teach on when they teach Isaiah 17, is that Israel actually shakes. They take a severe hit. We're told in Isaiah 17, verses 4 through 6, that in that day, meaning the day that Damascus gets destroyed and desolated because of Israel, it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob, now that would be Israel, will wane and the fatness of his flesh grow lean. He goes on and talks about some agricultural idioms. There'll be starts off that there'll be a healthy wheat harvest. He's giving examples when they go into this war. But in the second phases of the war, there'll be only gleaning grapes during the grape season. Now these seasons, wheat versus grapes and olive, I'll talk about olive in a minute. They all happen subsequent to each other. So Israel goes into the war. They're prosperous. The second phase, their glory's starting to wane. Their flesh is waxing lean, and all that's left would be gleaning grapes. So in other words, the clusters of grape can't be harvested. All that's left is the gleanings, which are left over for the table scraps. And it says then there'll be like the shaking of an olive tree with only 2 or 3 olives in the uppermost branch and 4 or 5 in the fruitful branches. Now we're talking about an olive tree that can produce 500,000 olives, one of the most popular trees inside of Israel. Instead of 500,000 olives, Israel takes a hit to the north. In the uppermost branch, that'd probably be the Haifa area. Just a few olives left there. Tel Aviv, probably the fruitful branches in the mid part. I superimposed on the DVD a olive tree over the nation of Israel, so we can look at the top of the tree and the middle part of the tree. And I think what Isaiah is talking about is by the time the end of the war happens, Israel's fatness, his flesh has grown lean because they've taken a hit. But not only them, of course, we have the countries that are involved attacking Israel. Desolation in the strong cities. Damascus gets destroyed. The other attacking nations flee, we were told, and I read that in Isaiah 17, verses 12 and 13. Of course, when they see Damascus get destroyed, they'll flee. They'll get as far away as they can. And you mentioned, why is it Syria invading Israel? Well, we need to remember that Syria, under the banner of Syria, which would include, 3,000 years ago, Psalm 83 was written by Asaph. It included Assyria, which would include Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah and Tyre, Hamas and Gaza, the Philistines. All these populations that are also proxies, and even more, including Egypt and Saudi Arabia, are involved in Psalm 83, and they want to take Israel and give it to the Palestinians. It says in Psalm 83 they want to cut the nation of Israel off, that the name will be remembered no more, and they want to take the pastures of God for themselves. Zechariah 12 tells us in verse 2 that someday those countries around Israel will lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem, but they won't win. God says it'll be a cup of trembling, and Israel Defense Forces will win a war against them. So we're talking about probably a combination of the Syrian war involving the proxies of Iran, then burgeoning into the major Arab-Israeli war of Psalm 83. I think we've got some very important wars coming forward, Sam, that are going to, once they come, it's going to change the whole landscape of the Middle East.
And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask Bill some of the chronology of these that we're talking about and how they go. He's kind of alluded to a couple of things, but I'm going to ask you, Bill, to be a bit more specific. But to conclude this chapter, at the end of this war, Israel wins. You know that. You've said that. They are bloodied. They've lost a lot of their standing. Clearly, at that point, they are a weakened country. Any other concluding facts about what we know about Israel at the end of this particular conflict?
Well, at some point, they're going to have to remuster their fortunes, get their glory back, because ultimately in Ezekiel 38, which we'll talk about in the concluding segment, we see an Israel that's robust. They're dwelling safely without walls, bars, and gates. But that's not going to be the case when they're going through these wars. And as I conclude, I want to read one really devastating headline that just came out in the Israel National News. It says, predicted scenario, 6,000 rockets at Israel during the first days of war with Hezbollah. 6,000 rockets. It says Israel's defense establishment is preparing for the worst-case scenario during a war with the northern border, which would include days-long blackouts, hundreds dead, and thousands wounded. And they're saying in this report that 6,000 rockets could come in the first few days, and then that would taper off to, in the second phase, 1,500 to 2,000 effective rockets a day, just from Hezbollah, not Hamas, not Syria. And these effective rockets mean they won't fall indiscriminately into the fields or be intercepted by Iron Dome. So, Sam, we're talking about a scenario Israel is very well aware of and very concerned about, right?
Yes, indeed. All right, ladies and gentlemen, when we come back, I want to conclude with Bill by taking this particular Isaiah 17 war, Syria, Damascus, where they're involved, and tie that in and ask him to lay it out chronologically, Psalm 83 war, Ezekiel 38, 39, what we know, and try to put them as best we can in order. Bill, when it comes to the events of the day and the timing of this Isaiah prophecy that we're talking about, can you take where we are now and as best as we can figure, as you have studied and laid out, is this conflict with Syria, Damascus, is this the next thing on the list? Psalm 83, we've mentioned that. Where does that come? Ezekiel 38, 39. When does that come? Obviously, Battle of Armageddon's at the end. We know it's going to be at the end. But can you take and lay out what we know, timing-wise, chronologically, of these conflicts that the Bible gives indication about?
Yeah, I think there's at least 4 potential pre-tribulation wars. 3 of them, I'll talk about quickly, I believe they're imminent. They lack any preconditions. I call them now prophecies in my new book called The Future War Prophecies because they lack preconditions. One of them, Ezekiel 38, has some minor preconditions. So I'll sequence them as I suggest they could happen. I'm speculating, but this is how I think this could come out here in the world scene. I think the imminent prophecy of Isaiah 17, there's no reason Israel is already striking Damascus frequently, already 4 or 5 times in 2023. And I don't see any reason at all why Israel won't be involved in a war with Syria. It could happen at any given moment. And we could wake up one morning and the next, Damascus doesn't even exist as a city anymore. That's what we're told in Isaiah 17:14. I think also involved in that is a war in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39 with Iran and the Elam prophecy, which is on the west coast of Iran, ancient prophecy written in 596 BC. Now, Iran wants to wipe Israel off the map. They're getting nuclear weapons prepared to do that. They should have those soon. Israel's going to probably have to fight them and go to war with them and attack that. They're already preparing for that to stop Iran's nuclear program. That could lead to the war with Syria because Syria is a proxy of Iran. Ultimately, I think when Damascus goes up in smoke and ceases from being a city, I think the Arab world around them go in an uproar. They're going to go, oh my goodness, Israel just took out a major Arab city. Our cities could be next, Beirut, Mecca, Cairo, Amman, Jordan. They're going to be concerned. Plus, they're going to see Israel's, we talked about in the last segment, they're going to take a severe hit of shaking. And they're going to think to themselves, we can come get Israel now, or else we might lose our cities as well. Ultimately, after all those events happen, Israel rebuilds, becomes prosperous, and dwells safely without walls, bars, nor gates, which are preconditions for the Ezekiel 38 war. I think these wars set the stage for the Ezekiel 38 war, which is really important because that's the war God stops supernaturally with an earthquake, fire and brimstone, flooding rains, pestilence, hailstones. And that's the war that God says, I will make my name, holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. They shall not profane it anymore. And the nation shall know I'm the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. That's the event where God is going to put the world on official notice that he's the promise-keeping God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that covenant-keeping God, and the promise-keeping God of people who put their faith in Jesus Christ. So I think these wars will be coming sequentially, probably starting soon, and they will culminate with the ultimate statement of God when he stops that advance from Ezekiel 38 supernaturally, that the world goes unnoticed, going, yeah, that's the God of the Jews. He keeps his promises and his covenants.
So just a couple minutes left here, but let me make a connection here or two. The Isaiah 17, Syria-Damascus conflict, that war, as you say, we can see those pieces there. You're reading the headlines. We're reading the headlines, too. That's half in there. The Jeremiah 49, the Iran-Elam conflict, and as far as that goes, to Psalm 83. The Psalm 83 war we've talked about here before, the collar nations around Israel attack. In reality, Bill, do you see any necessity why these conflicts, Isaiah 17, Jeremiah 49, Iran, Elam, and even the Psalm 83 conflict, would require a long length of time between them, or could they actually occur in rather quick, in rapid succession?
I think they will, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't. The only thing standing out in the way of Psalm 83, which involves Jordan and Egypt, along with another confederate bunch of nations, is two fragile peace treaties Egypt has with Israel and Jordan has with Israel. But those can be ripped up in a moment's notice, and they probably will be, because we find Egypt and Jordan are the subject of their own war prophecies with Israel as well, probably peripheral events to the Psalm 83 war. So I don't see any reason why these things couldn't happen, probably sequentially, or even kind of grouped together. They might even come together pretty quickly, like Isaiah 17 and Psalm 83 could actually be, and Isaiah 17 and Jeremiah 49 could also be kind of connected. So I see these things all relatively connected in a short order of time.
And in some cases, we're just about out of time. It's clear, like Isaiah 17, that what we call it, the Israeli military, IDF, they do what is required. They have victory there, but in the other ones, there is no one to help them, and God steps in, like Ezekiel 38, and it's very clear that there is God and God above, and that's where you say that connection comes.
Right, Sam. The Israeli Defense Forces exist in fulfillment of Bible prophecy for pre-tribulation wars. That's in my Future Prophecies, Future War Prophecies book.
All right, fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, prophecydepot.com. Look at all of that is there. We've talked about. We're running out of time. Thanks for being with us today, Bill Salus. God bless you. Thank you for all the work that you've done and the clarity of laying out this information today. I hope and pray that it helps all of you listening to better understand where we are and, wow, the amazing days in which we live.